Welcome again, everybody, to the Tyrannus Hall podcast, where we're aiming to make the Great Commission every church's mission, every Christian's passion. And we're so excited here today to be speaking to Mark Mulder, who's a brother from the other side of the world. He lives in Papua New Guinea, where he's the principal of the Reformed Church's Bible College. And we're going to speak to him about his work there and also what we can learn as local churches from the foreign mission field in Papua New Guinea and how that might inform how we do our own task of mission in everyday life. So, Mark, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. So you've been in Papua New Guinea for about 5 years. Previous to that, you were living in Australia. Before we launch into specific questions of what we can learn from your experience in Papua New Guinea, how did you get from Australia to Papua New Guinea? What were you doing before you became a missionary? And why did you decide to become a missionary?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I was a teacher, and I was busy in that role for about 29 years, I guess. And during that period in time, I'd been involved with the mission board. And whilst on the mission board, I'd done a few trips to Papua New Guinea, and I'd established a really good friendship with Reverend Ian Wilderbore. And through that meeting, mission work really started fascinating me, and just thought, wow, it's a real special place to be. And when you go to a mission field, it really touches you. You don't come back just untouched. You either feel that you need to do more work there, or you think, well, that's not really for me. I wasn't really sure whether I could go there and work, because my wife, every time we went there, didn't really feel too well and felt a little sick. And so I thought, well, in a way, the Lord was saying to me that was not an area that I ought to be going to. And I was quite comfortable working at the school in my role as a teacher, and that was all okay. But it was the Toronto Mission Board that approached me and asked if I would consider taking on the role as principal of the Reformed Church's Bible College. And initially, I remember saying to Brother John Smith that I wouldn't be wanting to apply for it. And he said, look, please just consider it. And so I thought, okay, I'll do him a favor. I'll consider it, and we'll see what happens. And in a way, I said that in the hope that he might not keep thinking about this position, because we had met in Papua New Guinea for an on-fields mission conference. So we parted ways, and in a way, I was thinking, well, I'm hoping that's the end of that. But he actually did get back to me and asked, so Mark, well, what have you come up with? And I said, well, I'm still not really sure about this position that you're asking me to consider. And I explained further to him that, Liz did get sick whenever we went there, and I still had a role to play at the school that I was working at, and that I thought that was important work as well. I got approached after that by Reverend Cor Klein, who is actually a missionary at the Bible College. And he had come to Western Australia for a furlough, for a bit of a break. And one of his first meetings was to come and visit myself and Liz. And he asked if we'd considered it. And he basically was pleading with us to think about working there in Papua New Guinea. And again, I agreed with the thought that we should, take this a little bit further. And it wasn't till, I think, 1 or 2 days after that we were walking through one of the local shopping centres, and Liz said to me, I think we could actually give this a go. I think we could probably get across to Papua New Guinea and work there on the field. And, well, you can imagine how surprised I was about that. And so we sat down, we thought about it, we prayed about it, we read, we realised that a decision like that did have consequences. And in a way, the Lord placed a burden on our heart, and you can't walk away from that. And I couldn't, with a good and free conscience, just say, no, Papua New Guinea is not for me. Someone else can do it. And there was a realisation that we needed to go. And so we got back to the board and said, yes, we'd apply. So the rest is history. Right? We ended up on the field.
Praise God for the Spirit's work in your life. Praise God for a willing and faithful wife. And, there's lots of reluctant prophets in the Bible that sort of go kicking and screaming to the mission field. So glad that the Lord worked in your life like that. Could you just outline for us briefly what you do as principal of the Reformed Seminary there, or the Bible College?
Yeah, for sure. So prior to me being the principal there, Reverend Henry Versteeg was the principal, and he was very busy in the churches and then also running the college, so teaching, but then also doing a lot of the administration work there at the college. And because we were really hoping to get the college to grow, it was very awkward in the sense that he was busy in the churches and busy at the college, and it was very difficult. So there was a bit of a shift in thinking that they ought to employ or get someone to the field whose sole focus would be within the running of the college. And that's why I guess they were targeting someone like myself who had a teaching background and had some experience as being an administrator within the education sector.
So does that mean that do you today teach courses at the college and do the administration?
Yes. So I do teaching and the administration, and that allows people like Reverend Cor Klein and Reverend Hans Vartstra to do teaching, but then also to be busy in the churches.
So Mark, you've had to learn the language then as well, or do you teach in English? How does that work?
Yes, so we do learn the language. I've had to learn the language. By learning the language, you get to understand the culture a whole heap more. I wouldn't say that I'm great at the language, but I can get by. The interesting thing is in Papua New Guinea, when you do teaching, you're supposed to actually teach in English. And so the teaching all takes place in English, but there are sometimes in discussions we go to a little bit of Tokpisin, especially for some of the students whose English isn't that great. You can explain it in the local language, and it just comes across a bit better for them.
Can I jump in here? What did you mean that you understand the culture better when you learn the language?
Well, apparently, again, but by understanding the language and by being able to communicate in their language, you begin to understand a little bit more about how they relate to one another, and there's a greater acceptance of you as an individual, and in that way they share and they open up a little bit more about themselves. So it's really more that way.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. Winston and I on this podcast sometimes talk about contextualization, which is conveying the message of the gospel to a culture in terms that are accessible to the culture. And learning a language is an easy example of contextualization. But I'm kind of curious about what you said, which I found to be quite insightful. What are some things that you've learned about the people and the culture there that are different from the people and the culture from which you emerge? What is something that's strikingly different about the culture there that you've learned since coming 5 years ago?
Yeah, I'm a real slow learner on this one. The big thing here in Papua New Guinea is relationship. It's all about relationship. It's all about relating to the people and making sure that your relationship with the people is good and is strong. And so they are very event-oriented, whereas we are very time-oriented. And those who know me, I'm really, really time-oriented. And so over the 5 years, I've had to really fight against my old self and try to put the timing aspect to one side and just let it go and just let it be. And it's all about a relationship with the people. And as an example, church is supposed to start at 10 o'clock in the morning, and church never starts at 10 o'clock in the morning, not ever. It always starts later. And that's because not everyone is necessarily at the church building at 10 o'clock in the morning. And so whoever is responsible for suggesting that church ought to start, he's looking out over the congregation to make sure that different people are there. And if they're not there, well, then we'll just wait. We'll wait till they're there. And once they're there, then the church can start, because it's an event. It's not It's not so much about time, it's about that everyone is there and then we can start the service. And so initially, sorry.
Mark, I was in Dominican Republic years ago, went into the sugar plantations where the Haitians worked and traveled with a missionary there from church to church. And I asked the missionary, what time does church start? And he says, it starts when everyone's here. So it was exactly what you're talking about. It wasn't about time. It was about people. And they waited until everyone was there and then church started. That's a very fascinating observation you've made, that they're event oriented rather than time oriented. And it's something that I've observed with immigrants to Canada as well, depending on the culture from which they emerge, that it's the same sort of fatigue that you see. So I'd like to ask a follow-up question there. What are the ways in which you can build relationship and build trust with people? I mean, in some cultures that revolves around food and eating. Is it something similar in PNG?
Very much so, Bill, very much so. It's exactly that. So it's about opening up and telling them your story. And they love hearing stories about what it is that you did. They love hearing stories about family. They love hearing stories about our children and about, that some of our children, one of our children is married and has children. So we've got grandchildren. So they want to know about the lives of the grandchildren. They want to know about the lives of my brothers. They want to know about the lives of my sisters. And you mentioned food. That too is like the glue that brings everything together. And I was just talking to some friends earlier today that really big gatherings, we always make sure that a pig is offered and the meat is shared. And if you share pig meat, that means it's a really big event, and it means that there's this is a really important big do.
Yeah, these are the things that when you're a missionary going from one culture to another, that you have to learn, that you have to pick up on, and then you have to learn to adapt so that you can enter in relationships, so that you can do the job of a missionary well. And they're the things that you totally don't think about at all when you live your everyday life in your own culture, surrounded by everybody who thinks like you. And you don't think about the fact that you yourself have a culture, and that you yourself have all kinds of things. There's a way in your home culture that you develop relationships. There's a way you get things done. There's things that you do to signify that an event is a big deal or not. There's all these things, but you don't think about them just because they're sort of ingrained in yourself. So I'm interested to ask you this question then. So you've been 5 years in Papua New Guinea. When you come back to Australia, or you've come back to to other places in the West, are there things that you sort of start noticing that you didn't perhaps pay much attention to before?
I think the one of the big things that you notice immediately is materialism. You immediately see that everybody has access to everything. They don't necessarily have everything, but they've got access to it, and it's there. It's available. Things run very smoothly. So that's a really big difference that you see immediately when you come back, that you never really paid much attention to before you actually went there onto the field. And I think too, you notice immediately too how everyone is very much involved with their own lives. Again, you go through a shopping centre and you walk through the mall, and over here in Australia anyway, everyone's got their heads down and they're holding the phone, and they're all like little individual islands moving through the corridor of the shopping centre. And that doesn't happen in Papua New Guinea. Everyone is talking to everybody else. There just seems to be a whole heap more interaction between people.
I want to ask a question about that, Mark. So here in Canada, at least, I don't know if it's true of the Western world in general, we're very good at superficial conversation, weather, sports teams, and we shy away from religion, politics. Those are the taboo subjects. And I've been busy locally with international students. And I've made this discovery that there are people from different religious backgrounds in different parts of the world that are surprisingly eager to talk about exactly those things that we in Canada shy away from, namely religion. What's your experience in Papua New Guinea? Is that sort of taboo too? Or is it, can you freely talk about Jesus and expect interest on the part of your audience?
That's actually been one of the liberating things for both Liz and myself. We here in Papua New Guinea, we can speak so freely about Jesus Christ and about his work and about the need to commit to him. It's amazing, and it's the most beautiful thing ever. We can be in a coffee shop, and we might have ordered lunch, and we'll pray, and so I'll lead in prayer, and the people who are serving, they stand to one side and they wait till you're finished, and then they come and place the food down. And when we got here, we did the same, but the person who was serving us didn't seem to grasp that we were praying and just barged in. So I had to stop the prayer, wait for her to finish putting the food down, and then we continued praying because, well, it wasn't going to happen otherwise. Whereas in PNG, that's certainly not the case. They have a deep respect for things that relate to religion, and they love it when you speak about those matters. They don't always agree with you, but they certainly have no problem about you raising it. On our vehicle, we have a sticker that says Reformed Ministries. And so when I pull up to a fuel station to fill up with some fuel, they see Reformed Ministries and they immediately think that I'm a pastor. So they say, pastor. So I have to explain, I'm not a pastor, actually. I'm just a principal, and so you don't need to call me a pastor. But then when you speak to them about Jesus, they immediately respond, and they say that they believe in Jesus as well. Sometimes you wonder if they're just saying it because that way they can stay in your good books, so to speak. But the fact that they don't have any problem talking about it is really, really refreshing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that the contrast between that and the realities of our own culture. If I take a train from Ottawa down to Hamilton area where Bill lives, and if I sit on the train next to somebody who is a new Canadian and is coming from somewhere outside of the European world, I can strike up spiritual conversations with them immediately and engage them on that for long periods of time. And when it's somebody who's a Canadian of European background, it's so much more difficult. They often don't want to speak to you. If you raise something, they try to shy away from it. That's sort of a taboo subject. Yeah. So which just means that you've got this added extra challenge, because like what you say, it's been so liberating for us to do that in PNG, and then it ends up feeling the opposite of liberating for those who are who are living in in a place like Canada or elsewhere in Australia. Mm. So yeah, there's this added challenge. I'm wondering about this. I lived for 5 years in West Africa and then lived for 10 years in Quebec outside my own culture. And I know that there's something that living outside of your own culture where you're already a strange person that somehow makes me more confident in sharing the gospel, or more eager to do so than when I'm in my own home culture. And perhaps some of that is sort of a fear of man, afraid what people like me might think of me, and I'm less afraid of what people that are not like me might think of me. Right. I wonder sometimes when I was in West Africa, is there some sort of paternalistic attitude that you adopt? You'd be like, I can speak the gospel to these people because perhaps I think I'm better than them, or I've certainly got a different social status than them. It's a little bit like you see it in street evangelism. If you've ever done street evangelism in the Western world, and you go with people who do street evangelism, it's not like they walk up to the people that look necessarily their social equals, or who are dressed up in a fancy suit going off to a business meeting. They often go to somebody who looks like from the outside that they might be able to carry the conversation as their social economic superior. And so, yeah, you got any thoughts on that? That question has been rattling in my head for a while.
I think you've nailed it, actually. I totally agree with you. I know when I get back to the West, you have to fight against yourself in the sense of when, for example, when food is delivered to your table and you want to pray out aloud with your wife, or if some of your friends are there, because you know how the people in your own culture think about religion. And so you think, well, I know that they don't really want to engage with it, so I'm not actually going to pray out aloud. Whereas in PNG, they do wish to engage with it, so I do pray out aloud. You're so right. It's really somewhat bizarre, and so I know this time around we've made a very deliberate thing about we will just pray out aloud when we're in a restaurant, when the food comes, for example, or if an opportunity arises where we can speak about Jesus Christ and Him crucified, then that's what we're going to do. And that's in a way just too bad, because in PNG it's a much easier thing to do, and it's given us a lot more confidence to be able to do it when we get back into the West. Exactly as you suggested.
I like your use of the word deliberate there, because if we're having this conversation trying to draw lessons out for our own lives, for those of us who live in Canada or Australia or elsewhere, one of the lessons there is that it does take deliberate intention and decision to say, I'm going to live like this. I'm going to do this, and I have to be intentional and perhaps even verbalize that. Even when it comes to, for instance, you've been mentioning prayer in public. So if I decide before I go into the restaurant that I'm going to ask the server if he or she has anything that they would like me to pray for them about, because I'm a Christian and I'm going to pray before my meal. If I make that decision and verbalize that with somebody before I go in the restaurant, I do it. But if it's in the moment, I often don't. Yep. And so, having a deliberate intention when you're saying, I'm going to go here, or I'm going to meet this person, I'm going to be in this situation, I'm going to be deliberate, reminding myself, praying about it, perhaps say, I recognize that I live in a culture that mitigates against sharing my faith. And so I'm going to be deliberate in doing that. Yeah, that's a good lesson for all of us.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience in this respect, that if I pray frequently for opportunities to share the gospel, I see and find opportunities. If I don't pray for opportunities, I don't see opportunities. I'm sure there are always opportunities, but I'm not seeing them if I don't pray for them. But I think that's part of the intentionality that Winston's talking about. If we see ourselves and live deliberately as missionaries, we're going to find opportunities. But I want to ask you a question in particular about that, Mark. So one of the things that Winston and I have been saying on this podcast is that we in Canada, and I suspect this would apply to Australia as well, need to see ourselves as mission outposts or as mission churches, because it's simply not the case anymore that our countries are Christian in the way that they were, and that most people are going to church. I mean, there was a time when city council meetings began in prayer, public schools began in prayer, Christian prayer, no less. It's simply not the case. Christians in Canada, and I suspect in Australia, are in the minority. And so I wonder what your comments are on that, because you're sent from Australia to PNG for mission work, and a lot of mission work needs to be done there. But should we rethink our churches in terms of mission outposts in our native countries as well? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Certainly, I certainly agree with you that we need to be very focused on using every opportunity that comes our way when we're here in our own country, in our home country. And I don't know about you, but often at the end of the day, when you come to the Lord in prayer and you reflect on the day and you realize the many opportunities that you've missed in speaking about your belief and having that opportunity to share Christ. And there are often points that you feel really bad about, that you feel really sad. And you always want to make sure that, well, the next time that happens, I'm going to approach it in this way. And so then I agree. I think that our churches do need to be busy contacting and sharing the gospel with people in our backyard, so to speak. And I think the interesting thing is a lot of the younger people today, I think, are very, their minds are in a funny sort of a way open to the spirit world. They've moved on from scientific thinking, and there's a lot of spiritual thinking. A lot of it is wrong thinking, but they're open to that idea of spirituality.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Winston.
I was going to say I entirely agree with that, as well as a younger generation that has not had experience with churches like their parents and grandparents did, and lack a whole lot of biblical understanding of, in general, but also lack negative experiences with the church. And they might have false ideas about it, but I would say the same. I found that especially in Quebec, for instance, where the older generation had left the Catholic Church en masse, but the younger generation had no experience with the church, didn't know anything about the Bible, and were more willing to be engaged in spiritual conversations.
Yeah, and we see the same thing here in Canada, or in Ontario, even for that matter, where, secularism is a process underway, but it's not translating necessarily into a larger number of atheists. So there are still young people, they're certainly not Christian, but they're very open to a higher being, a God of some sort. They may even have some prayer practices. They're spiritual, but not religious. They're detached from religious institutions, but have a spiritual component to them. And it's fascinating to me because on the one hand, you have Christians who are deconverting. This is a thing in North America. I don't know whether it's in Australia as well, but some who are rejecting the Christian faith. But there's also this phenomenon among young people who are not Christians, that their own views are somewhat fragile, and that makes them open to the gospel in a way that their parents maybe were not, who, as Winston said, may have had bad experiences with the church. So, but I want to get back to this question about, so you've been in PNG and you've acquired some expertise there as a missionary. How might Australians contextualize the gospel in their communities? What are ways in which Australian churches might do better at being mission outposts or promoting the gospel? And I'm going to assume that this will have relevance for churches in Canada as well.
Yeah, well, that's a real challenging question, and I mean, I don't want to come across as being the person who's got the answer and this is how you do it, but I do think that as a reformed community, we really need to be reaching out into our wider community and showing the love and trying to help the people who are down, who are out, and not putting them to one side and thinking of them as people who can't achieve anything, or thinking of those people as being people, well, if I just look at that person, there's no way that they would accept Christ, so it's pointless talking to that person. These are all people who are image bearers, but unfortunately a lot of them have lost their way, and we need to point them in the right way again. And I think we can do that by reaching out, by supporting them in just establishing contact and having a cup of coffee with them and sharing some food with them. And it gets back down to even what's happening in PNG. You share some food, you sit down, you start a relationship that way, and then you show that you are dinkum in terms of your life as a Christian, that you're not ignoring other people.
Oh, you're going to have to translate the word dinkum for all of our Canadian listeners.
That you are very real, that you operate with integrity, that you do what you say that you're going to do.
I've never heard that word before. That is great. I've just added a word to my vocabulary. I'm going to try to incorporate that into my sermon Sunday morning.
Yeah, that's my immediate thought. That's what I was worried about, Bill. So I like your advice, Mark, in you're sort of taking your experience in PNG and saying, look, relationships are primary, and being in relationship and giving people a sense of belonging before they might actually be confessing the name of Christ. I'm wondering how we attach that then to your other comment that when you come back to Australia, some of the cultural things that really strike you are materialism and, everybody involved in their own life and their own comfort. And then also everyone sort of acting in their own individual bubbles, with your head down on your phone or, however that might look in life. Because those two things, I think, are amongst the biggest challenges to doing mission work in North America, because you want to engage in relationships with people. More and more, they end up living in a little silo and a little bubble with their phone or with their, people oftentimes have a very small network. And then also that people who are confessing Christians in our churches, as well as the broader community, are really focused on their own comfort and sort of climbing up the economic ladder, and people buy a house with the plan to get a bigger one, and they buy a boat with the plan to get a bigger one. They buy everything is you get something, but you're actually hoping for something more, and you're always thinking about accumulating. And the messages that are bombarding you constantly, making you dissatisfied with what you have, and you need to buy more. And yeah, those are extremely difficult challenges. Also extremely difficult in order to enter into real meaningful relationships with people in that context. So yeah, wondering from both of you, how do we do that? How do we preach the gospel and build relationships in that kind of particular culture?
Oh, look, that again, very difficult and very challenging. I think, when we go to work and we surely that there's a point during the day where you talk to somebody else, and you could just, I think it's just a thing like asking people how they are, and you gauge their response. And then often the response will highlight whether they are feeling on top of the world or whether they're not. Now, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but over in Australia, very quickly people will say, oh, everything's good, it's fine. It's almost a way of saying, don't probe too deeply, because I don't really want to open myself up too much to your questions. But when you really listen to what they're saying, even the way they say, oh, yes, I'm fine. Sometimes there's little opportunities to just wedge that response a little bit wider open, and then something comes out where, well, actually, I'm not quite okay. My wife just left me, or I've got this financial problem, or I've got this, or I've got that. And then I think they are just little opportunities where you can just suggest ways of moving forward. You don't have to immediately say this is the way, but just quietly suggest that they could do this or they could do that, and that you're prepared to give them help if that's what they want. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's very sage, Mark. Community is very relational, and it sounds like the people in Papua New Guinea are honest and upfront about that, and North Americans at least are not. So we live on our islands, in our silos, and pretend that we're happy, but I don't think we are. So this is the challenge that we have in North America. How can we be relational with people who act like they don't want to be relational when in fact deep down they do? And I think it's along the lines of what you're suggesting, just being super attentive to people in our communities, whether they're neighbors or co-workers, listening to them, asking them questions. I found that it's helpful at times to ask the question, how can I pray for you? Or, you know what? I've been praying for you regularly. What are some specific things I could pray about? And that's it. People don't see that as hostile in the way that, posing the question, where do you think you're going to go when you die, or something like that, might be interpreted. But I think, Winston, part of this is we just need extraordinary patience. We're sowing and we're sowing and we're sowing, and we often don't see fruit immediately. But I think attentiveness, empathy, curiosity, care are ways in which people will eventually open up to us.
Can I ask you a little bit of a different question, Mark?
Yeah.
So as the principal of the Reformed Church's Bible College there, if we were to look at the curriculum that you put students through, Would we see, and we would compare that to a Bible college here in Canada, would we see any different emphasis or anything that is perhaps more emphasized because of the culture that you're running the school in? Anything that you're like, oh, in this particular culture, because of this particular culture at our Bible college, we have to emphasize this aspect at the school in particular. Would we see any of that?
I think you would, particularly, see, if I can just very briefly outline how we've organised the Bible College. We offer a 2-year certificate course and then a 3-year diploma course. Now, the 3-year diploma course prepares the students for life as a pastor. Now, even if they don't quite make it to the end, they certainly will become very, very well-equipped church leaders. And within the diploma course, then, there are courses that relate to exegesis, to Old Testament survey, New Testament survey, there's church polity, there's ethics, there's dogmatics, all those kinds of courses. In the certificate course, I guess we're much more practically oriented. So we certainly have courses that relate to scripture. We have courses that relate to the catechism. We have a course that teaches English. But then we add all these different modules, and they are very practical. They're about youth ministry. They're about children ministry. They're about church ministry. There's about leadership. It's about public speaking. And then I think there's some areas where it's very, very much of benefit to our brothers and sisters in Papua New Guinea. Courses that relate to peace building or to Christian marriage and family life or to parenting. I know that those courses in particular are very much enjoyed by our people who are at the college, because they said, we've never, ever heard of this before. Things about Christian marriage and family life, things about parenting. Some of the questions just absolutely blow you away, that you just think, how is it possible? But again, it makes you realise how fortunate we are that we were raised in the environment in which we were raised. And that's not even necessarily a reformed environment, but that in the West we have this, or had an understanding of what it meant to be a parent. And maybe we've lost it a bit, but certainly in PNG, there's the parenting and the Christian marriage and family life modules. They are real eye-openers to our students.
That's really beautiful. So if I'm understanding correctly, somewhere along the line, missionaries as well as national church leaders perhaps, or other church people have sort of identified that here's some areas of culture in Papua New Guinea where we need some specific Bible teaching because it's an area that we need to grow in, or an area that has not been paid attention to, or that we have a blind spot in. And so you've put that into your curriculum and focusing on that, and it seems to be bearing fruit and is enjoyed by people. There's a great lesson there for us too, because it's difficult to examine your own culture, but to get to the point where you can examine your own culture, if you live in a place like Canada or Australia, and say, okay, so where might our blind spots be? Where would we perhaps lack in some biblical teaching and understanding that we would need to have a particular emphasis on? I wonder, for instance, it's just wondering, based on your former comment about, materialism, is, do we have a good understanding of how we relate to the material world and how we relate to riches, and how we, how do we live in that dynamic as a Christian? Or is that something that perhaps we haven't paid much attention to and we need some specific teaching? Or I imagine that there's other areas that we need to do similar thing. So yeah, that's something that makes sense. It makes immediate sense on the mission field, but I think it's a lesson learned for us and to do it at home as well.
True.
Yeah. I don't know, Bill, you have any other questions for Mark?
Well, I have many questions for Mark. Maybe just a quick one. The course that sounded most fascinating to me in the list that you gave was one, I think you called it peace building. And is that because conflict is something prominent in the culture there? Because I don't know that would necessarily be a course in a Bible college here. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Certainly, culturally, this peace building, peacemaking course is really important. Really, in PNG, if someone wrongs you immediately go for payback. You go for revenge. And that's just what people do. And it always gets way out of hand. It gets very violent and very, very aggressive. And that's it's really, really unfortunate. And unfortunately, some of our students at the Bible college still fall in those old ways. We call it big man mentality, where they can't seem to humble themselves and just say, look, it's okay. So I've been wronged. It doesn't matter. Let it go. And so there was a real strong need to put in a peace-building course so that people could see that as Christians, that's not what we do. We put others before ourselves. We keep emphasizing to the students that love is sacrifice, that Jesus demonstrated that to the point of death. And they can say yes, 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 but, the rubber hits the road when at the end of a really long, hard day, it's hot, 30 odd degrees, it's 70% humidity, and they're tired, and then someone says something wrong. And it can be an explosive environment. And so it's a matter of just keep chipping away and keep persisting and keep encouraging them. I know there's one student, for example, who I very regularly, as I walk past him, I say, look, don't forget the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, gentleness, self-control. And we have a little bit of a laugh to one another, but he knows exactly what I'm trying to get across to him. Just let things go. Don't let it bottle up and explode.
Beautiful. Mark, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I got two last questions for you. The first one would be this: what is something that you yourself have learned personally from being in Papua New Guinea in terms of your own relationship with the Lord? Is there something that the Papua New Guineans have taught you and that they've influenced your faith in a positive way?
Yes. And I say this a little bit to my own shame, and that is never, ever be ashamed of the gospel. Not ever. And that's certainly what they've taught me. And I've been humbled by that. And I slip up. Every time I get back to the West, I slip up. I really do. And I don't wish to promote myself as a person who's just got it all together, because I don't. But I know that because of PNG, I try to be way more deliberate in terms of expressing my belief. And so that's one thing that really comes to the fore for me. And the other thing is I'm really humbled by my brothers and sisters in Papua New Guinea who are content with whatever it is that they've been given. And they just move on. And when we went to PNG, we Liz and myself basically sold everything because we wanted to commit ourselves to the work there. And initially we did it so that our brothers and sisters in PNG wouldn't think that Mark and Liz were going to suddenly leave us and go back to the West again, because quite frankly, we can't just go back to the West because we haven't got anything here, and that's okay. But the interesting thing is it was really, really liberating also, because actually we lived there in PNG and we still got a heap of things that when I compare that to what my brothers and sisters in PNG have got, it's still way more than what they've ever got. And so I've been humbled over and over and over again, and it's been a really beautiful experience for both of us.
Yeah, those are two beautiful lessons. Don't be ashamed of the gospel and learn to be content with what the Lord has given you. My last question to finish off our time together here is this: is that you just have off the top of your head, what's something that you would want to share with people here in Canada or Australia who are members of their local churches, would like to, see their churches themselves be more mission orientated? What's a word of advice or encouragement that you would give them?
Knowledge. Be busy with God's word. Be busy with God's word and learn how to apply that to your life. And then I think the rest all comes together. But really we easily go to church on the Sunday. We easily go to all the different meetings during the course of the week, but we also, unfortunately, easily rate those activities to our work activities, so to speak. And so we can almost polarize ourselves. And I think the advice would be, don't ever let that happen. Don't ever live two kinds of lives. We live one life, and that's only possible if we have a deep and rich understanding of God's word, and that we apply it to our life every day again.
Well, thanks very much for that. That's really good advice. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Mark.
Thank you so much for having us, for having me. Yeah, it's been a really nice experience. Thank you.
Bill, I found it pretty interesting that at the Reformed Church's Bible College, they have a couple of really culturally specific courses on peacemaking, on parenting, on family. So if you were to come up with a couple of ideas for culturally specific courses or culturally specific topics that Christians living in our part of Canada should pay attention to or could use some extra help in, what are some of the ones that would be at the top of your list?
Well, I think it's those things that we talked about in the podcast, and you had mentioned one of them, namely materialism. I find it kind of interesting in the church orbit in which I find myself that there's a variant of health and wealth prosperity gospel that you encounter where people will associate wealth and possessions and a nice house and a nice car with God's blessings. The implication is that if you don't have a nice house and a nice car, you aren't being blessed. So I think we could probably be helped by some instruction in the nature of wealth and materialism and decadence. And personally, I think we should commit ourselves increasingly to a lifestyle of simplicity. A simple lifestyle, I think, is what we should aspire after. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I want to keep my dishwasher and my microwave, but certainly they could be a lot more simple than they are. And the second thing I would say is how to have meaningful relationships and live in a meaningful community. I find that people have relationships, but they tend to be very superficial. People are very content. Youth are very content to be in their bedrooms alone on their phones, thinking that they're connected to others. And in some sense they are, but missing out on far deeper relationships. And it hurts us because in the end, we don't function as well as a community as we might otherwise.
Yeah, I like both of those topics. And I can think of immediately a bunch of things come to mind that demonstrate to me that we don't have a really robust understanding of how to deal with those. So you have, for instance, people who live lifestyles that just mirror the lifestyle of their unbelieving neighbor in terms of what their material goals are and what they, the consumption of goods and and possessions. But there's also people in our communities, for instance, that have been blessed with great riches, but don't know how to really think about that and feel guilt about that, or don't really know how to live as a believer and how to read certain texts, given the fact that they've got so much material wealth. And then you've got a whole younger generation of people who are looking at their future and thinking to themselves, I'm probably not going to attain the material wealth of my parents. I certainly, I'm not going to, buy a house anytime soon in Southern Ontario, and who are also starting to think more about valuing experiences or valuing other things than just accumulating possessions and trying to live a little bit simpler. Although oftentimes that simplicity is still very self-focused. It's not, it's a simplicity that, simple living makes my life better. So it's not, they could benefit from some more understanding around those issues.
Yeah, it ends up being consumerism of a different kind, right?
Yeah.
But it's still consumerism.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you can be consumerist and be like, I go out and buy all new fancy things for myself. But you could also be consumerist when you endlessly talk about the deals you got at Value Village and, and you're trying to engage in simple living so that you have more time for your own personal wants and, desires.
Yeah.
And then on the relationship one, I think just of the example of friendship and how in the West, we've had a real loss of same-sex friendship. And so, I read an author who said that one of the attractions for young men in war is that they get to engage in real intimate friendships, male-to-male friendships that don't have any hint of eroticism to them or don't have any suspicion of the erotic to them. And they get to experience a bonding with other men that is just really strong. And then in general, in society, a lot of people don't have flourishing friendships and wouldn't even know what that would look like. So I would agree that would be another topic that in our culture and day, if we would like to promote a Christian worldview and promote the gospel, we'd have to train people and think through those issues.
Isn't it interesting how if I use the word intimate friendship, a lot of people would think sexual. Yeah. But why can't we have intimate friendships that are non-sexual. And you, I don't know if this was true where you were in Africa, Winston, but apparently there are African communities and some Asian communities where men, friends, will walk down the street holding hands without a hint of homosexuality, but it's a close friendship. Did you encounter that?
Yeah, had those same experiences. The first time a male colleague grabbed my hand and, walked with me down the street, I didn't hear anything that he said because, from my culture, that has totally different connotations. But yeah, so, if you, it's difficult to look at your own culture, but when you look at our own culture and say, hey, how we deal with possessions, how we engage in relationships, there's blind spots that we have, there's things that we need to learn there. And then as Christians, we need to be equipped and to equip ourselves in those areas so that we can push back against the culture with the good news of Jesus Christ and demonstrate something that's beautiful and different about the way that the Lord has created us. Hey, thanks so much for, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say my wife was into minimalism for a while. And so we went through numerous purges in our house, and now it is a minimalist house in some ways. And I say with people, one of my proudest achievements is that I survived all of my wife's minimalist purges. I wasn't thrown out. I was kept with all the stuff she was getting rid of. Anyhow,
I'm so glad that you survived all of your wives. And I'm glad that you've gone to a minimalist approach where you just have one. we're gonna end it there. Thanks, Bill.
Wonderful. Have a good day, Winston.